Inquire with the chair the time remaining.
The gentleman has 5 minutes remaining.
5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'd just like to recognize my great friend from Texas, Mr. Chip Roy, who's been on the front lines of this issue. And when people say, I just want to add this, Chip, I don't want to take from your time, but people often say to me, well, what would you cut? What would you cut? Well, you know what I would cut from the state and foreign ops budget? Money going to the UN to pay for people to come to our country and cross our border illegally. How about cutting that? Sir.
Well, I would agree with my friend from Pennsylvania. I appreciate you having this time on the floor, and I appreciate my colleagues from coming down. The state of Texas is on the front lines, under siege. The communities that I represent dealing with the scourge of open borders, the dangers that are provided by cartels and the illegal elements that come across the border on a daily basis, and this body does nothing about it. This week, we're going to entertain legislation that will do nothing to combat China, nothing to stop China from continuing to run rampant around this world, violating human rights, undermining our national security. And we're going to put together a nonsense bill that's a Green New Deal agenda, pacify and appease China bill, when we should be saying what the woman from Texas said to the coach of the Miracle on Ice hockey team, beat those commie bastards. That's what we ought to be saying. That's what we ought to be doing. But no, here we sit, doing nothing. But you know what we are doing is we're sleeping while our border's wide open. But worse than that, the Biden administration and Secretary Mayorkas are taking purposeful steps to open our border, disregard the law, and to fail to faithfully execute the laws of the United States. And our country's in danger. And Americans are dying. Americans are dying specifically because of the actions of the Secretary of Homeland Security. That's what's actually occurring. We have fence rusting in fields in Texas. We have contracts that aren't being paid. In fact, we're paying people not to work, not to build the fences. We're not using migrant protection protocols. We're not using Title 42. We're releasing people into the United States against federal law. And we are not doing anything to actually secure the border. And therefore, the Secretary of Homeland Security should be impeached for it. I'll make one final point. Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, stood at the podium and laughed about our commentary about the borders being open and our streets being unsafe. And she lied. She lied about Border Patrol agents whipping migrants. It was purposeful, and it was done to divide our nation by race, the same kind of division that has the President of the United States choosing the race and the sex of the Supreme Court justice, the same man who blocked Janice Rogers Brown, blocked a black woman Supreme Court justice, blocked an Hispanic Miguel Estrada because he's Hispanic, because he's not the right kind of Hispanic. That's the truth. That's the truth of a president and an administration that wants to divide our country by race. They want to lie about our Border Patrol agents, and they don't want to do a dang thing about it. Now, yield back to my friend from Pennsylvania.
If you'll join me in a colloquy in the remaining 2 minutes, my good friend from Texas, Mr. Roy, we sent a letter asking for the report, didn't we, on this, these Border Patrol agents that had been suspended for allegedly whipping these Haitian illegal crossers. And of course, it never happened. Even the reporter, the photographer that took the pictures said that it never happened. The only thing that was abused or whipped was the truth and the reputation of our fine Border Patrol agents. Where does that stand right now?
Well, I'm glad the gentleman from Pennsylvania asked the question. It stands nowhere. They're not giving us any report. They said it would be a couple of weeks away, and I can tell you why. Because the report will demonstrate there was no whipping. It was a lie. And they owe an apology to those Border Patrol agents who are being abused on the front lines, having gunfire shot at them, dealing with COVID. No apology.
No apology. What about to the American people for lying to the American people and creating this division? Didn't our chief executive run and say that he was going to unite the country? Didn't he say that? He was going to unite the country. Isn't this an opportunity? Release the report. Look, none of us are perfect. We all fall short. I think we can agree. That's
Amen.
One thing we can agree on.
Amen.
When you fall short, is there something wrong with apologizing for your failures? Is
no.
there something that would
help? The president should apologize for that, and the president should apologize to every parent of a dead American kid who takes Xanax and dies with it laced with fentanyl because we have open borders, and the secretary knows it.
And the secretary knows it, and the secretary just went to the border, right? Talked to the Border Patrol, and what did they tell him?
And the Border Patrol was saying, what are we doing? We're doing nothing. And that's what the Border Patrol is saying. But my colleagues on the other side of the aisle wouldn't know that because we never have hearings inviting the people on the front lines to talk and actually hold the Secretary accountable.
Well, I thank my colleagues from the Freedom Caucus for coming and talking about what's happening on the border. I know that the left and the majority party in this House refuse to do it. Certainly the president refuses to do it, but we don't refuse to do it. We're going to do it because our country's in peril, our families are in peril, our community's in peril, and somebody's got to say something and do something about it. Madam Speaker, with that, I yield the balance.
Thank you.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 4, 2021, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, for 30 minutes.
Thank the Speaker. I'd like to thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania for his service to this country. We should all be down here engaging with our colleagues more often to learn more about him. Did not know that about your father. God bless you. Godspeed. Thank you for serving in this chamber. Madam Speaker, much has been made in the last week over the actions of two governors, in particular Governor Greg Abbott of the state in which I live and where I'm a congressman, Texas, as well as the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis. Much is being made of the fact that these governors transported certain individuals who had come to this country and were released into this country by this administration, I believe contrary to law, I believe in direct violation of both the text and the spirit of the law, that they were released into this country by the thousands. So Governor Abbott of Texas, Governor DeSantis of Florida, transported some of these individuals to particular locations. Now, it was very clear that they did so in significant part to make a point. And that point is that our states are bearing the brunt of an administration's policies that are purposefully allowing our border to be operationally controlled by cartels to the detriment of the American people. That's what's happening. So kudos to Governor DeSantis, kudos to Governor Abbott for bringing to light a problem which is being ignored by the leftist press that refuses to bring the truth to the American people. So 50 people get transported to Martha's Vineyard and the entire wine and cheese circuit loses their collective mind. Oh no! What have you done? Oh, cries of politicization of human beings, using them as pawns. But who is it who are using these individuals as pawns? Could it be my colleagues on the other side of the aisle or the people in this administration that are leaving our border wide open such that 53 human beings died in a tractor trailer in San Antonio, which I represent? So which is it? Which is worse? 50 people being sent to Martha's Vineyard to bring attention to a problem so that all of these Americans on Martha's Vineyard could put their glass of wine down and put their cheese plate down and suddenly recognize that there are literally thousands of people being distributed into our country every single day by this government and by non-governmental organizations. Every single day. My colleagues do nothing about it, and 53 human beings died in an oven that was a tractor trailer, and my Democratic colleagues don't say a daggum word. Nothing. But they sure say something when suddenly 50 show up to Martha's Vineyard, and then everybody gathers around for a photo op and brings some sandwiches and pat themselves on the back for their grand compassion because, oh, we're enlightened leftists in Martha's Vineyard. We love everybody. So we're going to bring sandwiches, and then we're going to call the National Guard and say, haul them out of here. That's the truth. But where's everybody talking about the 53 human beings that died in that tractor trailer in San Antonio, Texas? One example of the thousands. There is a cemetery that has been created in South Texas with PVC crosses for bodies of migrants pouring across the Rio Grande in South Texas. That's what's happening to these people, getting sold into the sex trafficking trade, being abused by cartels, bodies littering ranches, dying in the Rio Grande River, dying in trucks, here in Washington, D.C., while the mayor of D.C. complains about, oh, we're now a border city, or the city councilwoman who said, well, we don't have the infrastructure for this. Well, welcome to the party. Because that city councilwoman declared D.C. a sanctuary city. That city councilwoman called for the abolition of ICE. And prior to the individuals being delivered to D.C. by Governor Abbott to the steps of the vice president who's supposedly in charge of securing the border, but can't find her way to the border if you give her a map and a plane ticket to get there, 73 human beings were found in the nation's capital in a stash house right here within a couple of miles of this building, 12 of whom were kids. Where are my Democratic colleagues? Burying their head in the sand because it's not politically expedient to acknowledge that open borders results in dead migrants, dead Americans, empowerment of cartels, empowerment of China, and a danger to the American people and our national security, while almost 100 individuals associated with terrorist countries or terrorist organizations have now been apprehended coming across our border, not even dealing with the million people that were gotaways. Now, I've given this speech so many times, but I keep having to update it. I keep having to come down to the floor and talk about what's happening in Texas, what's happening to our people. Now let's talk about what's happening to Americans. The faces of the individual and the lost voices of people who have died from fentanyl. I showed these to the Secretary of Homeland Security, and he scoffed. 72,000 lost voices, 72,000 dead Americans in 1 year. More than we lost in the entirety of the Vietnam War. Right here. Where are my colleagues on the other side of the aisle? Where is the President of the United States? These individuals are dead. Their mamas found them in their house dying and trying to resuscitate them, and they left their home in a body bag because they took a pill that was laced with fentanyl that was cooked up in the backyard of a cartel, fentanyl coming in from China, and they're dead. That's what's happening, and my Democratic colleagues are nowhere to be found. Nowhere to be found. Evidence that a lot of the American people have that we're going to change anything. Because you got to actually change something. We have, immediately following the election, the re-coronation of Mitch McConnell in the Senate. The adoption of essentially the exact same leadership team on this side of the aisle. And what is the first thing that happens in the votes, and what do Republicans do? In the Senate, 12 Senate Republicans voted for cloture just yesterday to codify, other than marriage between a man and a woman, and trample on the religious liberty rights of Americans to disagree. That happened yesterday. Mitt Romney, Utah. Trump won 58% of that vote in Utah. Cynthia Lummis, Wyoming, a 70% Republican state. Shelley Moore Capito, a 69% Republican state. Todd Young, a 57% Republican state. Roy Blunt, 57% Republican state. Joni Ernst, 53% Republican state. Rob Portman, Dan Sullivan, Lisa Murkowski, Richard Burr, Tom Tillis, Susan Collins. Republicans walking away from religious liberty, walking away from the definition of marriage. What better way to signal to the American people and your Republican supporters and voters that you've got your personal thing pulled together and you're going to represent them and change what we're doing in this town. Hard to believe the American people are cynical. Hard to believe that. Yesterday, we had a bunch of votes on rules and procedures in the Republican conference. Again, it's a private meeting, despite the fact my colleagues love to leak it out, so I don't like to get into what specifically was done behind halfway closed doors. But I'll just say this, there wasn't an overall warm and fuzzy feeling about change. Very little changed. In fact, one of the things that did change was to just pull away a 200-year-old precedent dating back to Jefferson's manual about vacating the chair. It is my belief that sitting in the Speaker's chair, you'd want to make very clear that you're confident that vacate the chair would never be a problem. Yet, Republicans circled the wagons yesterday. You know why? It's about power. It's about the fear of losing power. It's about the fear of change. It's about the fear of empowering the body to do its thing. It's about the fear of open debate. It's about the fear of regular order. It's about the fear of votes. It's about the fear of taking tough votes. I don't fear tough votes. But I will say something to my Republican colleagues. Don't talk to me about change or what you think is changing until you tell me about the process you're going to use to bring bills to this floor. Because if I don't have the right to amend it, if I don't have the right to represent my constituents, if I don't have the right to have a voice, and you're going to come down and whip me and whip my colleagues to support a bill crammed down my throat by a rules committee that I didn't vote for or select, if you're going to tell me I've got to eat that vote, then that's not representative government, and that's not the way we should do things. When you bring a bill to the floor of the House of Representatives through a rules committee and it's told to be must passed, National Defense Authorization Act, which by the way is not must pass, always considered such, appropriations bills. How many of my colleagues went to the microphone yesterday saying, look, continuing resolutions are destroying our military. We need actual appropriations. You know what? I do not disagree. But when you offer a rule change to say, I tell you what, if our Senate colleagues will work with us to get the defense bill passed, then maybe we can consider the other things. And they're saying, well, no, we don't want to bind our hands to the Senate. But that sounds nice, doesn't it? The truth is, what they don't want to do is give up the ability to do what they always do, which is try to jam through an omnibus spending bill with backroom deals cut in order to try to drive up defense spending. I support our defense. I want them to be properly funded. But I don't want them to get more blank checks. When are we going to have a debate about guns and butter? When are we going to stop spending money we don't have? When are we going to have an honest conversation in this body? Is it when we turn off those daggum cameras? Is it when we decide to actually offer amendments on the floor again? You're not going to change anything if you keep doing the same stuff. That's the truth. 2 days ago, I stood up and nominated my friend Andy Biggs for Speaker of the House as the nominee for the Republican Party. Andy did not win that vote. He's my friend. My friend Kevin McCarthy won that vote and earned over a majority of the Republican conference. That news has been reported. Virtually everything that we did in that meeting or said in that meeting was literally verbatim tweeted out in real time or leaked to the press in real time. That's the truth. I have a rule when reporters talk to me about what happens in a meeting that I tell them it's a private meeting and I don't think I should talk about it. But when things leak out in real time about what's being said and what's being done, you at some point have to go explain to the people you represent, to your supporters and people broadly, what were you doing? Because if you can't have a private debate and a private conversation among family, and it's going to be made public, well, then you've got to go explain it. So allow me to read the speech that I gave in the Republican conference meeting nominating my friend Andy Biggs. It went like this. I rise in support of my friend and colleague from Arizona to serve as Speaker of the House. Andy Biggs is a proven leader who has demonstrated leadership here in D.C. as well as serving as President of the Arizona State Senate in a slim two-seat majority. He is a committed conservative and a good man. Andy's candidacy is not an attack on Kevin, with whom a number of us have been engaging and will continue to engage in good faith. Andy's candidacy is about his courage to stand here today, willing to take arrows, the courage to offer a debate rather than a coronation, the courage to say perhaps, just perhaps, we should consider changing the way we do things in this broken Congress, in this broken town. A town to which our constituents sent us specifically to change it. While there are many factors impacting last Tuesday's elections, the outcome is not so much murky as convicting. Our voters, Republican voters, expected a reckoning. And in so doing, they gave us nearly 5 million more Republican votes in congressional elections than my Democratic colleagues. Yes, redistricting can explain why we gained perhaps a smaller margin than anticipated. But it's not enough. What did we run on? In the 1990s, we ran specifically on crime and a bold agenda to transform Congress. In 2010 and 2012, we ran specifically on cutting spending. Meanwhile, this year, bold conservative leadership outside of this city was affirmed enthusiastically by voters. No one better represents that than Governor Ron DeSantis' overwhelming dominance in Florida. But we also saw Governor Lee in Tennessee, Governor Kemp in Georgia, Governor Reynolds in Iowa, Governor Abbott in Texas. And we saw our own colleague Lee Zeldin's powerful run for governor in New York, where he fell short but helped flip 4 seats. Because Lee ran on something, crime and the rule of law in New York. DeSantis ran on something, fighting COVID tyranny directly and fighting wokeism directly. Governor Abbott ran on something, securing the border, ravaging Texas. Meanwhile, in a midterm election against the most radical, leftist, and dangerous White House in American history, we left the Senate in Democrat hands. And we're looking at a 3 to 5 seat majority in the House of Representatives. So what do? I hear a lot about unity. Amen. But it has to be real unity. If we just say we are unified, it will not do a thing if the Rules Committee jams a disastrous immigration and border security bill like happened in July of 2018. Or consider that, to the best of my knowledge, the House Freedom Caucus, which represents about 20% of the body, has 1 member of the steering committee, which has 30 people, 1 member of the 20 standing committee chairs. Or respectfully, how about all the PAC money that was spent around this town in favor of leadership-tapped candidates? For example, Rodney Davis over Mary Miller, 2 incumbents. That's why I give you that example. But it's not about any one person or group. It is about empowerment of the whole Republican conference, not just a select few. We say we are for limited government, we Republicans, but how do you expect to decentralize the power of Washington if we cannot even decentralize our own leadership structure? Our republic is on the edge. Americans and their families are being crushed by a weaponized government, radical wokeness, vaccine mandates, open borders, crime, inflation. Yet voters don't understand how Democrats who have championed such destruction still hold so much power and largely avoided the reckoning that we talked about. We talk a lot about accountability. I ask everyone in this room, how can we hold them accountable if we cannot hold ourselves accountable when we come up short? Today's voting date, this being 2 days ago, is an arbitrary date, rushed, in an environment where many of our voters believe the system is rigged against them. A vote for Andy is a vote to shout stop and to stand athwart the status quo. It is a vote to pause and debate. It is a vote to empower every one of us to have a say and to have the ability to use our election certificate to its fullest. It is not a vote against Kevin, but a vote to force us all to the table to figure out how, not if, how we will come together as a party to reshape the conference rules, rethink the makeup of steering and the very structure and operation of the Rules Committee, and most of all, to lay out a specific agreed-to agenda and battle plan around which we can unite and to inspire and win the minds and hearts of the American people. Now, that is an internal debate among Republicans. I think it's healthy. I think it's good. The question will be, will Republicans stand for change? Or will Republicans stand up for the continuation of the status quo? The status quo ain't working. It's not. That is an indictment of both parties. That is an indictment of this institution. It is an indictment of this town. We come here called to represent the American people. We come here called to engage in debate and discourse. And as I've said before on this floor, how often have you seen a legitimate and robust debate on this floor? I'd ask all the staff to sit in the room to answer, but that's not appropriate. They're the ones sitting here all the time, along with a handful of C-SPAN viewers. Everybody knows most of the time we're preaching to an empty chamber. Most of the time, if there's a lot of people on the floor, it's only for votes, and a lot of backslapping, and a lot of, hey, when's our dinner tonight? And a lot of, hey, what are we going to do tomorrow? When you leaving town? How fast can we leave town? How quickly can we get to the airport? Chip, don't demand another vote. Dang it, I got to get to my tea time back home. Yeah. But when was the last time you saw a rigorous debate? Yeah, okay, I know we sometimes have the majority leader and the whip go back and forth on a Thursday afternoon or a Friday for an hour. But it's all talking points. It's all posturing. It's all back and forth to say, let's go out on the steps and go give our speeches. When was the last time you had, let's sit here for 3 hours and let's debate Ukraine? All of us, let's get down, let's get here, let's carve up time. How about 5 days? Let's debate Ukraine. We've given them $70 billion. 70, and now the administration's asking for $37 more billion. Any of y'all got $107 billion sitting around? Well, guess what? Neither do we. We're just going to print more money. We're just going to print more money, send it to Ukraine, allegedly for a helpful goal of trying to help Zelensky stand up against Putin. Where's all that money going? Is any of that money going into the hands of certain companies that's then turning around and sending it to certain politicians here? Certain stories seem to indicate so. Any of that money going to oligarchs in Ukraine? Any of that money going into the hands of China? A lot of stories about all of that. I'm not even talking about accountability yet. I'm just saying that if we're going to vote on another $37 billion for Ukraine, shouldn't we debate it? Are we at war or aren't we? Do we have advisors there or not? Is it in our national security or not? Is it helping stability in the globe or not? Is it actually good for the people of Ukraine? Bad for Putin's power? And there's a lot of good debates around all that, and the answer might be yes to some of those, no to some of those. Have you, anybody, just throwing it out there, has anybody seen a debate like that on the floor of the United States House of Representatives? I have not. And I'm here. Few people have come down and given speeches. That's not the same thing. That's not the same thing as an actual debate. The American people expect us to do our job. I expect and believe that Republicans will end the absurdity of a closed-down Capitol, the absurdity of magnetometers to go onto the floor of the House, the absurdity of proxy voting. Proxy voting extended by the current speaker till December 25th, when Santa Claus is going to bring home the magic day when COVID disappears. Obviously absurd. Our goal and our intent is to open up this body and to restore the people's house. That has to be our goal. That has to be our mission. Our mission as Republicans cannot be power for the sake of it. I would ask or suggest to my Democratic colleagues that their mission should not be opposition just for the sake of it. I am proud that I have one of the higher voting records against my own party than most of the people in my party. I believe that is attached to some amount of consistency and not attached to the whip or attached to the party power structure. Doesn't mean I'm right. I mean, I think I am. But what it means is that I've got some guiding principles that I think ought to guide how I vote. And it shouldn't be just because we're in shirts and skins or, red shirts, green shirts. It shouldn't be blue shirts, red shirts. It just shouldn't be that way. We should be able to be united on taking power back from the executive branch and restoring it to Congress. We should be united on sovereignty of our nation and defense of our borders to ensure that cartels don't exploit them for human tragedy, sex trafficking, fentanyl, pouring in and killing American people. We should be united on a strong national defense used sparingly but forcefully, not entangled in never-ending battles, and not blank checks to countries representing proxy wars. We should be united in trying to figure out how to solve our fiscal crisis that's killing our country. Every one of us should wake up. We should literally not be going home right now. We shouldn't even go home for Thanksgiving. It is so bad in such a crisis, we should not leave here until we have a plan to stop spending money we don't have. And I'll go ahead and say right here, everything should be on the table. But we won't do that. Because if somebody brings up mandatory spending, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will run ads like they did against Paul Ryan saying you're pushing Granny off the cliff if you dare say something about Social Security or Medicare. You mean to say there's not a single dollar that we can save out of that without it being pushing Granny off the cliff? On my side of the aisle, they will not touch defense spending. And if you do, it's sacrilegious. You cannot touch defense spending. Chip, we need more. Doesn't matter what we got to do with that. We need more. You mean there's not a single dollar we can't save at the Department of Defense? There's not a single dollar we can't repurpose? There's no way to make that run more efficiently, more effectively, to have a strong military force that will kill bad guys and blow things up when necessary? I think we could do that. We should be united in that. You can't keep spending money you don't have. You can't have open borders and a lack of sovereignty. You can't. If we can't unite on that, what in the world are we going to unite on? This body is supposed to, even in our disagreement, stand athwart the executive branch extending beyond the powers given it in the Constitution. It's supposed to. Yet we routinely give the executive branch open-ended, long runways of power, and we both do it. And we know we do it. Why shouldn't we unite to restrain the executive branch if you actually believe in separation of powers? I will say right here and stipulate, I don't care who's in the White House. I don't want the president and the executive branch to have unlimited power. I introduced a bill under Trump. I'll introduce that bill, and I have reintroduced it under Biden. I'll introduce it again in January of 2025 if I'm here, no matter who the president is. We got the American people right now trying to figure out what they're going to pass down to their kids and grandkids. I've got staff, 25, 7, 8, 30 years old, saying, am I going to be able to buy a house? Literally, like wondering, looking around the country, pulling them up on maps, saying, how am I going to afford this? How do I afford a $500,000 house with 7, 8% interest rates? All the families across the country are trying to figure that out. They're trying to figure out why they're increasingly concerned about their safety and well-being. They're trying to figure out why kids in their schools are dying from fentanyl. They're trying to figure out why we can't just agree that there are men and there are women, and we can acknowledge that we can build our society around that without that being hate. Like, these are fundamental truths or fundamental elements of our society and how we organize ourselves. We have got to find a way as a body on both sides of the aisle to bring back common sense, normalcy, and in this chamber, regular order. Or nothing will ever change. I am strongly of the belief that we must change. I have tried to work with colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I've introduced legislation on a bipartisan basis. I've passed legislation on a bipartisan basis, despite being, I think, by any objective measure, on the more conservative end of the spectrum of this body. I don't care whether there's a D or an R after your name. I'm going to tell you what I think. And that is directed at my colleagues on my side of the aisle, running around backslapping about getting the majority. The majority and having the majority is absolutely useless if we're unwilling to change. We have to change the way we do things around here. We have to empower members of this body to have a say in what is brought to the floor, a say to amend the legislation, a say in open and real and true debate that is driven by a desire to lead this country forward on the most basic of terms. Open up the Constitution. Look at the powers granted in Article 1, Section 8. Ask yourself whether what we're doing is connected to those powers, and then ask yourself if we are not a stronger, freer, better society if we can agree to disagree and push decision-making as close to the people and families and communities and local and state leaders so that we can actually have a republic united around ideals and not at each other's throats, because that's what we are. Because we are trying to make decisions in this town for everybody. And that's both sides of the aisle. Federalism is not just some quaint word you talk about. It's actually central to the health of this republic. We cannot function if we can't agree to disagree. And you can only agree to disagree if you're not trying to solve every problem for every person and every family and every walk of life in this chamber, doing everything and actually accomplishing nothing. The beauty and the structure of this republic and its founding is in the diffusion of power away from any one person, any one entity. The diffusion of power across 3 branches of government. The diffusion of power among federal, state, and local government. That is the greatness of this country. It is the essence of the great American experiment. That we trust the people. That we allow the people to prosper according to their own work. That we help each other. That civil society matters. But we fundamentally broke not just this institution, we are breaking our country because we believe that an unlimited checkbook gives us the right to buy votes with it. And by doing it, you're breaking the spirit of the country. You're taking away the value of work. You're taking away the value of responsibility. It's not just a campaign effort to buy student votes by paying off student loans so you can be nice. You just destroyed the entire ethic of responsibility. Of a woman like my wife, the daughter of a single mom who went to college, made decisions about what college she would go to based on the cost of that tuition, who took on loans, who then took every step to pay them back, who drove a crappy little car in order to pay her loans off. What do you say to her and every other American like her who did it the right way, and you just say, here you go, we're going to pay off your student loans? And that's just one example of thousands, and my side of the aisle is just as guilty. Another blank check to solve something, a disease or an illness. Another blank check because Ukraine. Another blank check because you don't dare look a farmer in the eye when the farm bill comes up and says, look, man, I'm sorry, but farm plus SNAP equals a whole lot of debt, and we can't keep writing a blank check. How about another blank check for subsidies for unreliable energy? Here you go. Here's another check to buy off another company to destroy our grid, destroy our way of life, destroy American energy through a blank check. We're literally destroying the soul of the country every day we walk into this chamber. And that is not a good legacy. Everybody just walks around acting like, well, one day the think tanks and the world will come together and we'll solve all of the mandatory spending problem. That's the real deal. Stop writing blank checks. Actually have the responsibility to do your job. I'm optimistic about the American people and always have been. And there's a large block of the American people who are not going to just walk away from the republic that they inherited from their parents and grandparents and those that fought, bled, and died for this country. They're not going to walk away from the American dream for their kids and grandkids. But this body, every day that we meet, we make it harder for them. Why don't we stop that? Why don't we agree together to sit down and do the hard work that is required of us, to do it the right way, to spend within our means, to follow the constitutional order, to limit our affairs to the consequential things that unite our republic rather than meddling in the affairs of every American in every state and every local government? Why can we not sit down and agree to disagree and push decisions of disagreement down to the people where they belong and do our basic duty step by step? That is our calling. That is our opportunity. When you have a change of power and a change of leadership, it is our duty to follow the constitutional order. It is our duty to do it the right way. It is our duty to use the powers granted in the people's house to stand up in defense of the people who send us here to represent them.
Mr. Roy, seek recognition.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Well, I'm always interested to learn priorities. And what we saw from the gentleman from Rhode Island talking about priorities and trying to sweep under the rug the vast array of claims from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to defund police, quote after quote after quote on the record, calling for the defunding of the police, and then to claim $350 billion to go to solve that problem. Yet the Washington Post, in all of its right-wing nuttery glory, fact-checked erroneous claim by Democrats and Jen Psaki that the GOP, rather than progressives, had defunded the police. They gave them the three Pinocchios, quote, significant factual error and or obvious contradictions, i.e. mostly false. The $350 billion was to go to state and local aid, to sweep aside actually funding the police after local police were defunded, while crime skyrockets across the country. We know this to be true, but you know what, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they don't like to talk about those facts. When we had a hearing in here about the heartbeat bill, I said, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will not mention the word heartbeat the rest of this hearing. Guess what? They didn't. Because heartbeat doesn't really help the agenda, talking about a heartbeat, does it? And here, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't want to talk about dead Americans. Also, not very helpful to the agenda. 5,000 dead Americans, as my colleague from North Carolina pointed out. None of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to talk about those 5,000 dead Americans, do they? Not helpful to the agenda. My colleagues on the side of the aisle don't want to talk about the skyrocketing murder rates in the 12 major cities that broke their homicide records in 2021, all had Democratic mayors. Not helpful for the agenda. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't want to talk about victims of crime, that 89% of black victims were killed by black offenders. We don't want to talk about that or talk about ways we can address that because it's not helpful to the agenda. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't want to talk about the dead Americans from fentanyl. 100,000 dead Americans from drug overdoses and poisonings. Don't want to talk about that. Not helpful to the open borders agenda, causing Americans to die. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they don't want to talk about the deaths piling up from this body's COVID policies. Suicides, mental health issues, people dying because they couldn't get health care because of lockdowns. No. Let's just run away from that. Let's just sweep that aside. Let's not talk about excess deaths. Let's not dive into and have hearing after hearing about excess deaths when we're talking about tens of thousands of Americans of excess deaths for non-COVID natural causes. Are we studying that data? No, because it's not helpful to the agenda. My colleagues simply don't want to talk about these issues. They don't want to talk about the dead that are resulting from radical environmental unicorn energy policies around the world. We're seeing play out in real time because my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are so committed to their radical leftist environmental energy agenda that they want to bury their head in the sand as to what's actually happening when you don't drill for American oil and gas and have a strong position in the world to ensure that we've got energy abundance to make sure that we're secure, free, and have the energy we need. No, that's not helpful to the agenda. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, you know what I never hear from my constituents? I never hear from my constituents, oh, please give the Department of Justice more power. Please, Congressman Roy, will you please give the Department of Homeland Security more power? I just please. Please, Congressman Roy, will you please give the FBI more power? I want the FBI up in my grill. I want the FBI targeting my parents. I want the FBI targeting Americans for daring to question the holy grail of school boards. Yeah, I get those questions a lot. And I would just point out in closing, following up with Mr. Jordan's points, the FBI's counterterrorism criminal divisions created a threat tag, edu officials to track instances of related threats according to the email from a whistleblower. The purpose of the threat tag is to help scope this threat on a national level and provide an opportunity for analysis of the threat picture for effective engagement with law enforcement. That's what this bill would do. It would empower federal bureaucrats, federal authorities to go after the American people. And that's why we're opposing it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Fired. And at this time, I would recognize the gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Earlier, somebody was positing what sets us apart as a country, and I would suggest that it is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and the constitutional framework that protects that. Quick question for you, Ms. Foster. A lot has been made about the implications with respect to race on the Roe opinion and what may come down this summer. Would you agree that if you look at the most recent data, 38% of abortions affect black babies?
Tragically, yes.
21% affect Hispanic babies?
Yes.
A lot of numbers have been raised about, or a lot of questions and issues have been raised about rape and incest. And in fact, you had an exchange with my colleague from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, about whether or not he would accept limits on abortion if there was, in fact, an exception for rape and incest. Can you clarify for the record, the Guttmacher Institute is a arm of Planned Parenthood, correct?
Yes, founded as the research arm of Planned Parenthood.
And according to data that I have, less than 1% of abortions are connected to rape, less than 0.5% are connected to incest, according to Guttmacher. Does that line up with your understanding?
According to the Guttmacher Institute, data suggests that most women seeking later terminations are not doing so for reasons of fetal anomaly or life endangerment. That's a quote. In fact, it's the same top reasons as first trimester abortions, which are financial hardship, relationship issues, and not feeling ready to be a parent, which are all issues where we as a caring nation and as loving communities can come alongside the woman.
And so I think it merits conversation that, again, to your point, yes or no, do you believe that your answer was the answer from Mr. Raskin, would it be a yes or a no? It would be no, correct?
It would be no.
You would not accept limits on abortion, even if you exempted the 1.5% that fall into that category. Ms. Arambidi, just real quick, you made a couple of points, I think, during your testimony about Texas. Not being a particularly hospitable place, generally, or with respect to women as it relates to abortion. And made a point, I think, about lack of care provided for women. Is it correct? I have information here correct. I believe that says that there are 8.5 pro-pregnancy and pregnancy counseling centers for every one abortion clinic in the state of Texas, that the legislature, in passing SB 8, appropriated $100 million for women's health care. I guess my question here is in light of that, and in light of Texas being an inhospitable place, according to your testimony, are you aware of how many people have moved to the state of Texas in the last decade? Do you know what that number is?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I will say that the clinics that you're referring to are fake
4 million.
clinics, and they don't actually provide
4 million
medical
people have
services.
moved to the state of Texas in the last decade. That's the population of the entire state of Alabama have moved to the state of Texas by choice in the last decade. I would move to one other question here. Ms. Robinson.
Could I finish my answer, though, about Texas?
I didn't ask you a question about that. Ms. Robinson, I would ask you a question. When is the latest that you have performed an abortion in terms of weeks of the unborn child?
Yes, my name is Dr. Robinson, and I provide abortion care in Alabama. So Alabama has...
What is the answer to the question, the latest that you have performed an abortion?
I'm going to answer your question. So unfortunately,
It's a number,
my
weeks.
state is one of those states that has passed restrictions or bans on abortion care, which limits physicians like myself
And
from
therefore,
caring for
in other words, you would like to do it
despite
later.
their
What is the
pregnancy
latest you have
continuing.
performed an abortion?
So since I will always follow the law and I live in the state of Alabama, I provide abortion care up until 20 weeks gestational age.
Okay, so you performed an abortion at 20 weeks.
Yes, sir.
And the procedure for an abortion, when we're talking about at 20 weeks, as I understand it, is dilation and extraction. Have you performed abortions at that stage? And in doing so, have you had baby parts that you've had to discard or store in some capacity?
One of the things that you all have done
Legs, arms,
throughout
eyes.
this hearing is just use inflammatory language.
Inflammatory, no, it's a question. Ma'am, it's a simple question. Have you had human parts, baby parts, arms, legs, as a result of an abortion performed at the time you just acknowledged you performed abortions?
I am a
up to
physician
20
and a
weeks?
proud abortion provider. There is nothing that you can say
yes
that
or no.
makes it difficult for me
ma'am?
to talk about the care that I provide
Right.
to
So
my
have there been
patients.
baby parts, yes or no?
If you would like for me to talk to
And
you
where
about
and how
we
have they been
perform an
stored?
abortion for patients who need care
So the answer to the
at
question is
20
fairly
weeks
obvious,
gestational age, I'm happy
that
to
there are baby parts, and you don't want to talk about how they're being stored. You don't want to talk about putting them in freezers. You don't want to talk about putting them in Pyrex dishes. You want to talk about the videos that we have from Planned Parenthood Gulf Coast in Houston, Texas. You don't want to talk about the reality of what actually happened.
Has expired.
If you don't mind me answering, all of those things that you just mentioned, I have never seen that in a healthcare setting ever. We don't put baby parts in freezers or Pyrex dishes. I've never seen a patient
Well, I asked where you put them.
hospital stop by and
Time
decide
has
she wants to
expired.
terminate.
Well, then where do they go?
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
The chair.
Would the gentleman yield? I think my time's expired, but if the gentlelady will claim time, I'd be happy to engage in a colloquy. I have 1 second, so. Yeah, I'll yield it to you.
Gentlemen, the gentleman's time has expired. Who seeks recognition? What purpose does Mr. Roy seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I was taken aback as I was dealing with a personal matter in my office while watching the committee unfold at the statements by some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about how it was not possible or appropriate or it wouldn't happen, I can't remember the exact wording, for states to be able to take care of this particular problem. The gentlelady from Texas the gentlelady from Texas had an exact quote along.
No, actually, if the gentleman yield, the state of Texas just unanimously passed active shooter alert and signed by Governor Abbott.
Reclaiming my time. Great. My point is, the gentlelady from Texas was talking about the inability of states to carry out the law enforcement function. And the specific, it literally said the quote, is why I got up out of my office and walked down here, as you literally said it. And my point is here we're talking about, federal spending, and the gentleman just said, well, Texas just passed this. Well, good for Texas, right? But we just act like there's this unlimited slush fund in this town to say we're going to go, there he goes again talking about spending. We're talking about, so $2 million, $50 million, $5 billion. Does it matter? Right, when we're $30.5 trillion in debt? My colleagues on the other side of the aisle,
Are you advocating defunding the police? That's who this is for.
what I'm advocating for is allowing the police powers of the states to be able to do the job of the states, which is to police the states. Like, that's the whole point. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they go hide behind this and say, we're not defunding the police because you guys have some bill in here for a grant program, because the idea of the grant program is to then go micromanage what the states have to go do, because that's the purpose of what you want to do. You want to use the federal money, the power and the coercion of the federal government to go tell states what they must do. And you want to do it with borrowed money. You want to do it with printed money.
Would the gentleman yield?
Not just yet. You want to do it with borrowed and printed money, because that's what we do in this town. We go write blank checks because we want to go give a press conference about all the greatness that we're doing in this town, all of the awesome things that we're accomplishing. Meanwhile, you say, well, are they going to do this or not? Well, they actually have to make a tough choice, because they actually have to balance a budget. They actually have to decide, are we going to spend money in a school? Are we going to spend money on teachers? But in this case, what we do is we say, we'll write a blank check. And then my colleagues say, well, we're not defunding the police. But yet it is Democrats across the country that are clearly defunding the police. Austin, Texas, which I represent, $150 million slashed from the budget. People are waiting. They call 911. They can't get through. They're trying to get police. Police aren't trained. The very schools, the police are not actually being recruited now because we don't have the money to recruit them. Why? Because Democrats in the progressive, quote-unquote, oasis of Austin, Texas, stopped funding the police. I could go list by list here of Minneapolis cutting their budget, New York City cutting their budget. Cook County, Illinois, Portland, Oregon, Austin, Texas, Baltimore, Maryland, Los Angeles, California, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, all slashed their budget, cut police budgets. And now my Democratic colleagues want to say, oh, in our infinite wisdom, we're going to go say, here is in our blank check, here's some more money for us to tell you what you have to do.
Would the gentleman now yield?
I will yield to the chairman briefly.
Okay. Very briefly, 2 points. One, these are voluntary. They tell no local authority what to do. The authority can decide what to do for itself. And secondly, with respect to defunding the police, Republican-run cities spend $361 per resident on police. Democratic-run cities spend $498 per resident, at 38% more than Republicans.
In reclaiming my time, that data does not reflect whether or not the adequate number of police or the appropriate level of police are on the streets for what that city needs. That's the whole point of federalism. That's the whole point of allowing people to decide what they want to do. And if Democrat mayors and Democrat city councils are going to across the country defund police, we see the consequences of it. You literally can't deny that in the last 2 years, there's been a massive spike in crime, and there's a direct correlation to the fact that we've defunded police across this country. It is literally in front of us, and the American people know it. And here we are again with the blank check format of the federal government saying, here's money, we're going to put it out there. And even the chairman just said, well, it's this voluntary program. Well, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Just let Rhode Island, let Texas, let Illinois, let California figure out how to police their own states. Because to the gentlelady from Texas, I'm quite aware that we have 30 million people and we have the 10th biggest economy in the world, and I think we can figure out how to police the streets in Texas. I yield back.
I'll recognize myself on the amendment. I'll be brief. I just want to point out a few things. Number one, the rate of murders in the U.S. has gone up at an alarming rate, but the lady yields back. Mr. Roy.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Secretary, there have been over 1 million plus individuals put into proceedings or released into the United States on your watch. I've asked multiple Border Patrol personnel, not the union, mind you, if we double, triple, quadruple the CBP budget, would that 1 million release go down? And they categorically said no, it would go up. Do you agree, yes or no?
I'm not sure I understand your question, Congressman. With the addition...
With the number of people being released in the United States under current law, would it go down no matter how much you increased your budget? And it would not. As they said, do you agree, yes or no?
Congressman, if I understand your question correctly, when individuals are in the United States and they make a claim for asylum...
So the number would not go down, is the answer, right? Yes or no? That's what they said, and I think you just answered it. It would not go down. The only plan that you offer, the plan you just offered, is to process aliens faster and encourage more to come. We know that to be true. I know it's true, you know it's true, cartels know it's true, and people around the world know it's true, and that's why people are coming.
That is false.
It's not false.
Yes, it is.
The entirety of your plan says that. The Secure Fence Act of 2006 says what? That the Secretary of Homeland Security shall take all actions the Secretary determines necessary to achieve and maintain operational control over the entire international land and maritime borders. Will you testify under oath right now? Do we have operational control, yes or no?
Yes, we do. And
we have operational control of the borders.
Yes, we do. And Congressman, we are working to...
Listen what operational control defined. In this section, the term operational control means the prevention of all unlawful entries into the United States, including entries by terrorists, other unlawful aliens, instruments of terrorism, narcotics, and other contraband. Do you stand behind your testimony that we have operational control in light of this definition?
I do, and Congressman, I think the Secretary of Homeland Security would have said the same thing in 2020 and in 2019.
No, the Secretary would have at least had a basis for saying that we have some sort of control of the border. But the fact is, we currently have people flowing across the border, including dangerous narcotics and dangerous members of terrorists, which your own agency sent a letter to my office after 8 months. We sent a letter saying there are 42 people on the terrorist watch list that are in the United States. But you just said to Mr. Jordan, you don't even know where the hell they are. And that's what you're saying is operational control, including entries by terrorists and unlawful aliens? It's not. It's not operational control. Mr. Secretary, let me ask you a question. When we're looking ahead and we're talking about asylum, okay? Here, if the officer determines at the time of the interview that an alien has a credible fear of persecution, the alien shall be detained for further consideration. Mandatory detention. Any alien subject to the procedure under this clause shall be detained, pending a final determination of credible fear of persecution. Is everyone being detained? Yes or no?
No, and as a matter of fact, Congressman, that is an issue that is before the United States Supreme Court. And
the fact of the matter is our law says they should be detained, and your agency is releasing people on purpose in order to flood the zone and make sure that more people can come to the United States. And you use parole to do it. Parole of aliens within the following groups have been detained. Come down here on a case-by-case basis for urgent humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit. Yet your office is using parole. But when you use parole, the fact is they're not showing back up to ICE. Your own letter to Senator Johnson, to this committee, have acknowledged they're not showing back up to ICE. How can you be saying that you have operational control or that we're securing the United States when they're not showing back up?
Congressman, are you actually interested in the facts and the law?
Yeah, I'm reading you the law, and I'm actually talking to you about the facts about who's into this country.
Actually, you're
now let's actually go to something that's
Chairman, can the witness be allowed to answer the question?
Well, there wasn't a question there to be answered.
Gentleman's time.
Point. Now let's talk about the damage being done to the United States of America. Mr. Secretary, do you know what this is? This is a mobile morgue, a body trailer, needed by counties in South Texas overwhelmed by dead migrants. That particular trailer is filled with these bodies, 27 bodies that were stored in this mobile morgue in South Texas with dead bodies of migrants. Dead bodies like this one found on a ranch just 3 weeks ago in South Texas. A dead migrant. Somehow that's compassion. How about the dead bodies found by migrants? Compassion. How about the ranchers who had to walk out of their door, and this is what they faced. Gentlemen with rocks threatening a rancher in South Texas, only able to be saved when they were able to bring their dogs out to scare the people away in order to save themselves. Or the fact that you've got houses being attacked, you've got livestock dead on the side because we've got ranches wide open. How about the little girl here with a brand on her arm? A little girl with a brand on her arm because of your policies. A little girl here in the desert found by ranchers trying to save their life. And how about the lost voices for people dying from fentanyl? The tens of thousands of Americans dying from fentanyl. Faces of Americans across this country dying because of fentanyl pouring into our country.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
You know full well.
Time of the gentleman has expired, Ms.
Encouraging people to come here, harming Texas and harming this country. You know it. And you're ignoring the
time
actual
of
truth.
the gentleman has expired. He no longer has time to slander the secretary.
Our colleagues, and particularly Mr. Jones, made the case when he said, let's not pretend that this is enough. He said nothing will be enough, but relegating the current members of the majority into the minority by packing the court. This isn't about ethics and transparency and recusal. Everyone watching gets the joke. That's not what this is about. This is about raw politics, a disdain for the current majority, a disdain for specific members of the court, and in particular, Justice Thomas. And I think in particular, because he's a conservative black man. And I think everybody gets the joke. Yeah, they said it, exactly, as my colleague from Florida made very abundantly clear. Let's not forget that when appropriate questions of recusal were being raised about Justice Kagan for having served as Solicitor General in the administration and then sitting on the court during Obamacare litigation, reasonable questions about recusal, that the immediate effort by the left was to do what? Attack Justice Thomas because his wife offered public opinions stating her opposition to Obamacare. In other words, this is not the first time. This is not the first time that we've had this conversation. It's not the first time that Ginny Thomas has been attacked personally or Justice Thomas has been attacked. And of course, this president, having been the chairman of the Judiciary Committee and having sat over the absurdity that was the hearing for Justice Thomas, knows full well exactly what they're doing. That's what this is about. And we all know that. I would also note that as we're looking here about what we're going to deal with next week with the hearing and talking about the leaked opinion, talking about Roe versus Wade, that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle sure as hell weren't bothered by this leak, but were when there were leaks that showed a disdain for conservative Hispanic Miguel Estrada in 2003, when there were memos outlining specific opposition by my Democratic colleagues, Democrats in the Senate, trying to take down, tear down, and destroy Miguel Estrada, specifically black and white language, because he's a conservative Hispanic. Oh man, can't talk about that memo because that was a leak of an internal Democrat memo. No, that was a horror that we couldn't talk about, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. But crickets, now that the Supreme Court has had a leak of an opinion coming from SCOTUS. I've listened to some amusement about talking about how the court was missing out on having Merrick Garland on the court, that paragon of moderation, don't you recall, from all of those talking points of the left, that he was the moderate, right? The moderate who just ruled that mental health must be considered for known criminals applying for asylum coming into the United States. That paragon of moderation targeting parents in coordination with the National School Board Association. Like, everyone understands what this is all about, and it's all always come back down to Roe, and we'll have more to talk about that next week. With respect to that case, I've heard enough from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle talking about how that is going to, because we couldn't, I think the quote from somebody on the other side of the aisle, we can't win that issue. We can't win that issue in public debate and discourse. Well then, if that's the case, what the hell are you worried about? If we can't win the argument on abortion in the Democratic debates, supposedly, then what's the concern? We know what the concern is. You want the court to put its thumb on the democratic process, and that's what this is about. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, is now recognized.
I thank the chair. Has the Department of Justice prosecuted a single case against individuals demonstrating at the residence of Supreme Court justices in violation of USC 1507?
I'm not aware that there's been a case brought under that particular statute.
So the answer is no. Does the purposeful movement of human beings and dangerous narcotics to the tune of 107,000 dead Americans across our border by armed and organized cartels pose a danger to the national security of the United States?
So I'm not familiar with the facts that you're referring to.
You're not familiar with cartels and their involvement with 107,000 dead Americans related to fentanyl. You don't believe that, you can't comment on whether that poses a danger to the national security of the United States?
I'm not familiar with the facts that you're referring to. I will say that there's no doubt that the movement of illegal drugs across our borders poses a threat to the safety and well-being of Americans.
What about threats to Border Patrol agents, such as signs displayed on the Rio Grande threatening to kill Border Patrol, or gunfire on the streets of Texas? Would that pose a national security threat to the United States?
You know, I don't know specifically what you're referring to, but obviously acts of violence directed at our law enforcement, federal or state, is a significant concern and one that we take very seriously.
A question before from one of my colleagues about known gotaways. He said 500,000. How about simply the 389,000 known gotaways that the Attorney General actually testified under oath here in the House of Representatives, accepting that fact that the Attorney General testified, I'm sorry, that might have been the Secretary of Homeland Security testified under oath. Knowing that, known gotaways, would that pose a danger to the national security of the United States?
I'm just not familiar with the facts that you're referring to.
Secretary of Homeland Security testified in this body. Assuming that fact, would you accept that as posing a danger to the national security of the United States?
I'm comfortable talking about cases that we are bringing or that we have brought that are a matter of public record where we've proven cases in court. I would prefer not to comment on hypotheticals.
Which poses a greater danger to the American national security, cartels or parents at school board meetings?
I mean, look, in groups, violent gangs that move drugs or are involved in acts of violence are a significant threat.
They pose a greater danger to the United States than do parents at school board meetings.
I would certainly have to agree with that. I would agree that, as a general proposition, being a parent myself,
I thank you for that.
Gangs and violent groups pose a greater threat to the American people.
I thank you for that.
That's a
candor.
serious question.
Is the Department of Justice still operating under the memorandum issued by the Attorney General Merrick Garland on October 4th, 2021, in which he said, quote, disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence to school boards? Are they still operating under that memorandum?
The Attorney General's guidance from last fall is
Continues
still in
operation.
effect. Yes, sir.
And the press release that was issued, Justice Department addresses violent threats against school officials and teachers. Your division is mentioned. Why?
So the National Security Division is part of a broader array of components of the Justice Department that have part of that effort to ensure that people who serve on local school boards or other bodies are safe.
You think parents at school boards rise to the level of the National Security Division at the Department of Justice?
I certainly think it's possible that there could be a threat or an act of violence against somebody in a local office, whether it's city council or school board, that might reflect a domestic violent extremist attack.
So you're saying yes. Is it appropriate to use the Patriot Act against parents?
So the Patriot Act is a variety of tools. I can't talk about it in the abstract.
Did the National School Boards Association recommend the use of the Patriot Act and describe that the actions of parents at school boards are the equivalent to domestic terrorism preceding the memo issued by the Department of Justice?
I don't know.
You don't know?
I don't know.
You don't know that there was a memorandum put out by the National School Board Association referring to domestic terrorism and the use of the Patriot Act prior to the Attorney General of the United States issuing a memorandum directly targeting and focusing on school boards? You don't know?
I've heard you and other members of this committee make reference to that today.
You're the head of the National Security Division, in which it's mentioned in the press release that goes out, and you don't know. You don't know. You're testifying under oath here before us that you don't know anything about that.
No, I've heard of that letter. I don't know exactly what it says.
Do you support the tagging of alleged threats involving schools or school boards as edu officials, as was made public via whistleblower?
So I think how the FBI characterizes its cases is a question that's better posed to the FBI.
One last question on a different topic. I sent a letter on July 11th requesting the Department of Justice conduct a thorough review of the Live Golf Limited and its potential violation of FARA. With respect to the $1 billion that the Saudi Arabians have pumped into targeting the PGA Tour, believing that is a, quote, great thing for the image of Saudi Arabia or, quote, an incredible investment for Saudi Arabia, that would seem to require some FARA registrations. I'm unaware of those registrations occurring. And asking my question, would you respond to that letter that we sent to the Department of Justice and brief members on that issue?
I'll take that question back to our Leg Affairs office, yes.
I thank you.
And the gentleman.
The House will be leaving town today, heading back to our states, heading back to our districts. Obviously, this will be a week of Thanksgiving. And obviously, I wish all of my colleagues well and safe travel. And we have much, of course, for which to be thankful in this great country. But there are great concerns that we face. Today, obviously, we had the speech in the news about the future of Speaker Pelosi. The outgoing speaker has had a long career in this body, and I wish her well. I wish her the best in the next chapter of her life. And some are saying it's an end of an era. And I would say that it's only an end of an era if we choose to make it so. Speaker Pelosi ran this chamber not terribly unlike her Republican predecessors, and I don't necessarily mean that to be the right way to do things. Bills that are cooked up in small rooms among leadership staff and members of leadership. Thousands of pages of legislation dropped on members at the 11th hour. Key pieces of legislation that are shuttled through committee without significant debate and then dropped on the floor. Sometimes we have what's called suspension votes, where we suspend the rules and we have votes on the floor with no members here to debate it or discuss it. Just take the word of the committees on which I don't serve. Amendments on the floor of this body restrained since May of 2016 under both parties' leadership. Some people refer to this as a cartel. Some refer to it as the swamp. What it is, regardless of branding, We know that it takes power away from the legislators and thereby takes power away from the people who sent their legislators here to represent them. The only way we're going to make this the end of an era is if we change the way we do things. And we should. And I'm saying this now that there is a Republican majority about to take the gavel. I believe we have to change the way this town works. I believe we have to change the way this body works. The reason that I introduced the Article 1 Act in the first Congress that I served in this body while President Trump was in office, to reclaim power from the executive branch, to say that we must have a voice in these ongoing emergency declarations, some of which date back to the 1970s. The reason that I did that was because I believed it, even though it would have taken power away from a Republican president. I'm wondering now if some of my Democratic colleagues will think, well, maybe that's not a terrible idea if we look ahead. I don't know. Here in this chamber, I am as a Republican calling on a fundamental change in the way we do things here, how bills get to the floor. Most people might not understand that the default rules that would go back to the Jefferson Manual and the basic rules of parliamentary procedure would be that I have the right to be able to offer a bill, and that then you'd have the right to amend the bill here on the floor of this body, this being the floor of the House of Representatives. But what the American people don't know is that every Congress we come in and we vote on new rules. And we vote on rules that then restrict the power of every member of this body to be able to represent their constituents. We restrict the power of a member to offer a bill, to bring that bill to a vote, to have debate on that bill, to amend that bill here on the floor of the House of Representatives. That's the way it works. And then we even go further. Every week we fly in and then we have votes on rules. Rules that are cooked up among 13 members of the House of Representatives who sit up in a committee up here behind these walls, and they vote a new rule, send it down here, and then the body votes on the rule that then structures debate for the week. Then can I offer an amendment here on the floor? No. And you know why? Because people are afraid to vote. Members of this body sent to vote on legislation and to represent their constituents are afraid to vote. Can you imagine? In the founding of this country, the establishment of this body, the people's house, to go get reelected every 2 years, or to go seek reelection, that we're afraid to vote? Do you know how many times, if I bring up opening the process and opening up the floor of the House, colleagues on my side of the aisle, the other side of the aisle go, well, don't you know, that means somebody could bring up a really tough vote. Well, if you vote no on a whole lot of tough votes, like I tend to do, you get kind of used to it. And you get used to what you have to do, which is go explain to your constituents why there ain't no free lunch. This isn't the United States House of free stuff. You can't just keep passing bills to spend money we don't have to buy off votes. You can't keep voting for bills that have a nice title so that you don't have to go back and explain why you voted, as I did, against burn pit legislation for veterans who need support and help for burn pits. But you vote against it because you don't need another $675 billion mandatory spending item. Yet bipartisan support for a bill because nobody wants to go say no. Nobody wants to go look in a veteran's eye and explain the hard reality of what we need to do in this body. Nobody wants to say no to a bill that says ALS research. Nobody wants to say no to a bill that says something about helping animals or helping old people or helping kids. You put a nice title in there and everybody's got to vote for it. Doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on, you got to vote for it. Because there is no spending limit. There is no restraint. There is no responsibility. There is no leadership. There is no check on unrestrained power of the executive branch by this body, because this body keeps funding the very tyranny of the executive branch that many campaign against. That's the truth. My colleagues on this side of the aisle just went out and sought election where we took the House back. My colleagues on this side of the aisle went out and campaigned against unrestrained federal power in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a Department of Homeland Security that refuses to secure the border of the United States, labeling of parents as domestic terrorists. They went out and campaigned against an energy policy of an administration that is destroying American energy, driving the price of gas up, driving the price of electricity up, destroying the grid of the United States, making us more dependent on China, on Venezuela, on Russia, on Saudi Arabia, on Iran. It's absurd. We ran against all that stuff, but you know what? Whole lot of my colleagues vote to fund all that stuff. Have no problem writing a big old check. Both sides of the aisle. You know why? Because they always have something they want that they're willing to just sign off on a monster piece of legislation, irrespective of the debt that is piling up around the ears of their kids and their grandkids, the destruction of the American dream that is happening because of that, or the funding of the very bureaucrats that are undermining the freedoms of the United States people every day. Come to the floor, it's got a National Defense Authorization Act. You come to the floor and you've got something you must pass. We have to pay for the pay raise for our troops. We must pay for some more planes and bombers and helicopters, missiles. Don't you know, Chip, that we've got to go stand up against China. We got to fund Ukraine. We got to stand up against Putin. Great. Let's have a debate on this floor about those things. If you're talking about war, maybe we should declare it. If you think that there's a proxy war with funding, maybe we should debate it on the floor of this body. Maybe you shouldn't just keep writing blank checks and never have a debate about guns and butter. But that's what we do. And this is where I got to have a little tough talk to my colleagues on this side of the aisle. What, pray tell, have you heard out of anybody on this side of the aisle that will change any of that? Yesterday, we had all sorts of conference meetings, debates about our internal workings. I tend to like to keep those meetings confidential and private, but half my daggum colleagues are tweeting that stuff out in real time. The fact of the matter is, nothing changed. The status quo remains because people want their power. They want their committee chairmanships. They want their gavel. They want the ability to control the power and the purse strings, but they don't want to look in the mirror to fundamentally change a broken town, a broken house, a broken body, a broken federal government that is stepping all over the dreams and the hopes and the future and the prosperity of the American people. There is not a remote indication that my colleagues on my side of the aisle understand what time it is in America. Understand what we're facing. It's not just a campaign statement. It's not just something to go rile up the American people to get elected. To get elected, to get power, to get on a certain committee. Do you know what every conversation that has been had in this body, at least on my side of the aisle, since last Tuesday? Hey, what's going on in the steering committee? Hey, who's going to get Ways and Means? Hey, who's going to get on what committee? Hey, did the freshmen have their votes? Who's going to be the head of the freshman class? Hey, who's going to be the speaker? Who's going to be the whip? I don't know. Let's figure out what we're going to do. Who's going to have power? Who's going to have power? Who's going to have power? And the answer is anybody but the American people. The answer is anybody but the rank and file members of this body. The answer is the status quo. That's why people ran. That's why President Trump, by the way, did well in 2016 running against the swamp. Say what you want about President Trump. He represented a large block of this country that were sick and tired of this town, of this place, of this body, of the people in this room. And it's high time we do something about it. Stop kissing each other's rear ends, asking and begging for some slot on a committee. We didn't come here to be on committees. We didn't come here to get a title. The titles around this place. Who is in leadership? Leadership. Isn't leadership something you recognize and follow? It's not something you elect. I didn't come here for second place. I didn't come here. I don't leave my family. I don't say goodbye to my son and my daughter and my wife every Monday and fly up here and spend 3, 4, 5 days up here and fly back every week just because I want to earn Southwest points. I didn't fly up here because I want to sit in rooms and go have a steak dinner and go talk to lobbyists about what needs to be put in a bill. I didn't come up here to say, well, we got to make sure we get, but don't call them earmarks. Oh, don't call them earmarks. That's already bad out there. So we're going to call them community-directed spending. Okay, we'll call them community-directed spending. The currency of this town. How are you going to take care? How are you going to get a bridge back home? Hey, it's important. We have floods in Houston. We have floods in Louisiana or Florida. So, they need flood money, right? Oh, we have tornadoes in the Midwest. Well, we need some tornado money. Well, how do you think you get people to buy? How do you think you get people to vote for all these appropriations bills that have left your country $32 trillion in debt? By the way, 5% interest rates, do you know what's going to happen? Interest rates going up where they are at 5%. You know what's going to happen to the interest payments? It's going to be another $600, $700, $800 billion. You pretty much just bought a whole second Department of Defense, ladies and gentlemen, with money that you're printing. How's that sound? Enjoy that, do you? And nobody here has any plan on what to do about it except more of the same. Oh, we'll have a lot of speeches about CHIP. Don't you understand? Entitlements, mandatory spending, that's the problem. That's 70% of the whole thing. Well, as a technical matter, that's not incorrect. But we got here because we refused to deal with it. And that's not an excuse to write a blank check for discretionary spending. Hey, we don't need to be responsible on discretionary spending because the actual problem is the rest of the spending. Even though discretionary spending is still $1.5, $1.6, $1.8, $2 trillion. Or is it $7 trillion? Does anybody know? Does anybody care? Hey, we shut down the whole country under COVID, but hell, we'll just write a $5 trillion check. Why not? Because that's what we do. We just keep writing checks that we can't cash.
January 4th, 2021, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, for 30 minutes.
I thank the Speaker. Appreciate my friend from Arizona being down here, as always, enlightening the American people and using the floor time in the honor of our soon-to-be leaving the House friend Louis Gohmert, and making sure that we use the time here to inform our constituents back home. As usual, the American people understand I'm speaking to a mostly empty chamber, with the exception of the Speaker and my friends who are now leaving, who are just here. This is pretty much what we get in terms of debate here in the House chamber. Earlier today, we had a little bit of back and forth on a couple of bills, but they're pre-programmed, like 30 minutes aside, pre-designed, all designed to get right off the floor. And I want to talk about that. That's why I'm coming down here today. Today, we took up two bills on the floor of the People's House. We took up a bill that is ostensibly focused on marriage and allowing recognition of same-sex marriages from one state to another. But in that bill is something that is pretty significant for the American people to understand, regardless of your views about how the bill is being sold, about it being about recognition of same-sex marriage. Actually, they say it's about codifying Obergefell and same-sex marriage. It does no such thing. It only deals with the recognition across state lines. But even if you think that's good policy, even if you voted for it, and I didn't think it was good policy, and I would have voted against it on the merits, in the bill is a sword, a private right of action, a private right of action able to be used to be able to go after.
Members, would you kindly take your discussions? Members? Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the Speaker, and I have no qualms with conversations on the floor, but I appreciate you giving me the ability to speak here. The bill that was on the floor today, ostensibly designed for marriage and recognition of same-sex marriage across state lines, includes in it a sword, creating a private right of action and creating the ability of the Attorney General of the United States to go after individuals for actions they carry out, their closely held religious beliefs. And people in this chamber voted for it, knowing full well that the language in that bill will allow lawyers and organizations to come sue Americans and force them into court. And their response is that, oh, don't worry, you have the Constitution of the United States and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Well, no kidding. I know the Constitution exists, and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act dates back to, 93 or 4, sometime in the 90s. But now, if you dare, as an organization, a religious school, for example, say, wait a minute, it is against our tenets of faith to hire a same-sex couple or an individual that's a part of a same-sex couple as a teacher at our school. Maybe another organization makes a choice along those lines. Now you're in court. Now you're having to go defend yourself. Now you're having to go take this up to the Fifth Circuit in Texas, up to the United States Supreme Court, try to figure out how they're going to interpret all this, whether, by the way, this law is even constitutional in the first place. All because our colleagues on the other side of the aisle wanted not just to provide for recognition across states, again, a proposition with which I do not agree, but not just that, they wanted to make sure that there was a sword to go after you if you disagree. Earlier this summer, a member of parliament in Finland was prosecuted for a pamphlet she distributed 20 years ago in defense of traditional marriage and in opposition of same-sex marriage. Now again, whatever your views are on the issue, let me be perfectly clear. What is happening today, what was decided today on the floor of the House, and all those members on that side of the aisle and the 39 on this side of the aisle who voted for that legislation voted for a sword to go after individual Americans and private citizens and private organizations for daring to carry out their closely held private religious beliefs. We will be back here talking about that. We will be back here trying to pass legislation to make sure we can protect them. And I offered an amendment up in the Rules Committee to try to get a vote on the floor of the House, and I was denied even the ability to offer the amendment. We couldn't even offer the amendment. And Lord knows I don't have the power to offer an amendment on the floor of the House of Representatives. And again, I want everybody out there in America to understand, not since May of 2016 has an individual member of the so-called People's House been able to walk into the well of the House and offer an amendment on a piece of legislation, this time as consequential as marriage and religious liberty. Again, let me reiterate, whatever your views are on the issue, and I have mine, Shouldn't we be able to debate marriage? Shouldn't we be able to debate religious liberty and the ability to protect your views and your closely held religious beliefs? But no, no, no. I was punted out of the Rules Committee for supposedly irony of ironies on a day in which we just authorized $860 billion in a 4,400-page bill that I got 40 hours before I voted on it, because it would score over $500,000, yeah, $500,000 over 10 years. And that wasn't even actually what the CBO said. They said it could, because it might create some revenues and some expenditures, and those expenditures, those outlays would be what? Damages if you went to court and you succeeded. So I want you to be able to understand my Democratic colleagues used a point of order to shut down an amendment to protect religious liberty if it would be successful to protect your rights. That is assuredly and 100% what happened, and yet it was just blown over, disregarded here in the House chamber, including by 39 members of my own party. Because that's the way this town works. The bill was dubbed a gay marriage codification of a Obergefell bill. So you had 39 members of my party go, oh, well, I'm got to be for that because, we got to be for, our libertarian type principles. Never mind that you were trampling on the ability of states and communities to be able to decide how they want to live, how they want to set up their communities, trampling on millennia, thousands of years of traditional marriage, which is designed very specifically for families and children. Tons of evidence and research on this. But we got to do that. We got to ignore the sword and the attack on religious liberty, and it was voted on today without a debate and without an amendment. It's extraordinary. But what else did we do today in this august body? So much debate and interaction and discussion among the 435 members here on the floor. What else was done today? I'll tell you what was done today. On the desk in the floor of the House of Representatives was a stack of papers up on the second level, 4,400 pages stacked up right there, which I got at 9 p.m. on Tuesday night. Now, we have a rule in the House of Representatives that you're not supposed to vote on legislation if you don't have at least 72 hours to read it. Now, why might you have that rule? I don't know, color me crazy. Maybe I should read what's in a 4,400-page bill. I know that's a radical position. I know that puts me over in the insane camp. Oh, there's Crazy Chip ranting on the floor of the House because, oh my God, he wants 72 hours to read a bill. Whenever I say this, you know how many people go, well, you know what's in the bill. What's wrong? How long does it take you to read a bill? How many members do you think read all 4,400 pages? Oh, but Chip, they've got staff for that. You got all the committee staff. The committee staff do that. We hold the election certificate. How many of your staffs you think read the 4,400 pages? I know my staff was poring over it late night on Tuesday night and all day yesterday just to see what was in it. Surprise, surprise, what do you find in it? 4,400 pages, $860 billion authorized under the National Defense Authorization Act. I had less than 40 hours before I was voting on it in plain violation of the 72-hour rule because we waive the rules all the time. We set up rules and we waive them. Nobody seems to care. It's, oh my God, I got a steak dinner to go to. I got a Christmas party to go to. I was down here last night debating the rule on marriage. I was solo. I was one, even on my side of the aisle. When I got finished, the House chamber closed. We were done. I rolled down the street, went to a Christmas party. There are a lot of members there. There are a lot of members all over this town rolling out down to their Christmas parties. But they sure as hell weren't here debating marriage and religious liberty. And what do we get? What do we get in getting this NDAA passed? We've got a vaccine mandate repeal. Well, or did we? I think we got a really important step forward to say that the members of the military shouldn't be fired if they dare question whether they must take a needle in their arm for a vaccine that has not been proven to be actually effective in halting transmission, and certainly not necessary for those who are young and healthy by virtually any account by any doctor that we've had testify on this. And so you reject the needle and you get fired from the United States military. So for 2 years, we've been calling on getting rid of the vaccine mandates. So finally, in December of 22, right on the way out, Democrats say, whoa, okay, in order to get this 4,400 page monstrosity across the finish line, we'll accept that we'll in 30 days undo the memo at the Department of Defense. That memo could be reissued. And in fact, the Democrat chair of Armed Services effectively said that. Are we going to get anybody reinstated? Are we going to get everybody honorably discharged? Are we going to be able to say, well, maybe you shouldn't be harassed? Because that's what happens. Oh, you didn't take a needle, you're not getting that job. You didn't take a needle, you're not necessarily getting that promotion. Retaliation. Again, for a vaccine that doctors and the CDC today acknowledge does nothing for transmission, that is unnecessary for people who are healthy and young. And here we are. We passed an NDAA in order to get, we finally got that vaccine mandate repeal language. Now look, I'm glad to get it. We've been fighting for it. We didn't get half a loaf. We got the crumbs of one piece of bread. But it was so important so we could stop the next person from getting fired. We sure as hell didn't help the guy who got fired last week. $860 billion, $45 billion above the president's request, 9% over 22 levels. Now look, I'm for more money for lethality. I'm for more money for a Defense Department fully capable of killing people and blowing stuff up. Because that's what you want your Defense Department to be capable of doing when called upon to do it. I am not for a social engineering experiment wrapped in a uniform. And unfortunately, that's what we're turning the Department of Defense into. Authorizing a Department of Defense Center for Excellence in Environmental Security on how and why environmental stresses to human safety and water and energy will cascade to economic, social, political, or national security events. Renewing the DoD's annual environmental and energy reports, establishing a joint working group on prioritization for energy systems, which, quote, may reduce conventional air pollution. Creating a pilot program for electric vehicle charging stations, having zero emissions by 2035 for non-tactical vehicles. Meanwhile, China's just pumping out aircraft carriers and boats, building their military, building coal-fired power plants. We ain't building any coal-fired power plants. We're barely building any gas-fired power plants. And they're out building their military, and we're focused on the coral reef, which appeared 286 times in the text of the NDAA. Well, what else did we do? We established a commission on reform and modernization of the State Department to offer recommendations to the President and Congress related to personnel-related matters, to strengthen diversity and inclusion, to ensure that the department's workforce represents all of America. Well, I'm sure China's shuddering. We ordered the DoD to submit a report on its efforts to increase marketing and advertising to adequately reach racial and minority communities. We require the Coast Guard to implement recommendation by the RAND Corporation to increase representation of women and racial and ethnic minorities. We require the Coast Guard Commandant to develop a 10-year strategy to enhance diversity. We talked about the coral reef before. We've got the Global Food Security Reauthorization Act. We've got a program for projects to combat coastal erosion in Alaska. What we don't have is a repeal of the 2002 authorization of the use of military force. It's been there for 20 years and we're not even using it. Why do we leave these in place indefinitely? What do we have in there? A provision that undermines Second Amendment rights. Creates a pilot program on the safe storage of personally owned firearms for members of the armed forces. It's on a voluntary basis, but here's the problem. It establishes a structure for the DoD to be providing storage devices for members of the military. We know what the next step is. Another grant program, another funding program through the Department of Justice, another program through another agency to be telling you you must take, or oh, you can volunteer to take, you take these, but you must put the gun in whatever facility, whatever storage device the government gives you. That's where this is headed. We all know this. They act like it's minimal, it doesn't matter, but that's what happens. Then we embrace it, and then that program never goes away. It just gets bigger. Not a little pilot program, just try something and then get out of the way. When does the government ever start something and not make it bigger? And we're sitting here with $32 trillion of debt, and all we're doing is talking about how much more money we're going to spend. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle said, well, why don't you increase taxes? Okay, I'll tell you what, why don't we have that debate? You can't tax enough to spend all the money we're spending. You literally can't. Like, run the numbers, put up a spreadsheet. If we ever actually debated and came down here and had serious conversation, we could have that debate. I'd love to have that debate. But we just keep writing checks we can't cash. What else are we doing? Authorizing and extending security support to Ukraine at $800 million without Inspector General oversight. Amendments were offered in the Foreign Affairs Committee just the other day saying, well, shouldn't we have more oversight with Ukraine money? Democratic colleagues said, well, we're for oversight, but not right now. Well, because why in the hell would we want to have oversight right now over the money we're now spending in Ukraine and how it's being used? No, let's just figure it out later. Because then what will we do? Nothing. We'll do the same thing we always do. Spend more money that we don't have. No one down here, not one member of this body can come down here and refute that. Because every member of this body knows it's true. And I'll throw that out there, challenge. Would love any member of this body, any of my 434 colleagues, come on down. Let's debate the proposition that we're going to do anything other than spend more money that we don't have. I'll wait for the takers. Because the fact is, it's true. And it's both sides of the aisle. Because here's what will happen. Next year, Republicans will be in control. Next year, there'll be all sorts of debate about appropriations bills. We'll go through all the motions. Maybe we'll pass some really good appropriations bill that holds spending in check to inflation or frozen at 22 levels or whatever. Come up with something. Anything any normal budget, family, business would do. Our guys will come down and do all that. Say, oh, woo, yay, look at us. We just passed something that is fiscally responsible, even if it's not. We'll say it is. Then what? We'll barrel forward. The Senate won't accept it. Sometime in August or September, right before a big government shutdown threat, senators will say, we're not taking that. Whole bunch of people will say, oh, no, defense. They need their appropriations. Whole bunch of people say, we need non-defense discretionary. Hey, I got an idea. Why don't we just spend it all? Let's just do that. Let's just say, yeah, we'll get a 10% increase for non-defense discretionary and a 10% increase for defense, and we'll just call it a day and say, well done us. We just spent our children's inheritance so we can go give a speech saying how, yay, we helped our military. Yay, we wrote a whole bunch more checks for a whole bunch more government bureaucrats and agencies because we have more grants and more programs to promise you more stuff at the United States House of Free Stuff, and we're just going to dole that out without regard to any responsibility whatsoever. And not one member of this body can refute what I just said other than the maybe hyperbolic examples, although I don't know that they're that hyperbolic. I'll wait and see next September where we are on the numbers. Because inflation's high, don't you understand, Chip? So why don't we just spend at inflation levels? Oh, good, so let's just increase the entire budget of the United States by 8, 9, 10% when we're $32 trillion in debt and when mandatory spending is on autopilot to continue just to blow through the roof. Oh, and what about those interest rate payments? Oh, those have gotten a little crazy, huh? Sitting here with now 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% interest. Woo! Didn't see that one coming, did we? Except that we did, but we didn't care because both sides will retreat to their postures and then they'll just kind of throw their hands up and say, Chip, it just is what it is. Biden's president, you need 60 in the Senate. We got a thin majority. So, man, what are we going to do? And here we sit. And I'll give this speech again in January, and I'll give it again in March, and I'll give it again in May. And then we'll be here in September, and I hope someone can prove me wrong, but I'll take the bet. There'll either be a CR, because we can't come to an agreement, which means we're spending at this year's levels, which is, I guess, somewhat fiscally better, but bad for defense and bad for how you do things, or there'll be a massive bunch of spending. That's it. Those are your choices. There will not be reasonable, sit down, do the job of what we're supposed to do. I believe I'm going to get in trouble about, I need to go do a radio interview, so I think I'm going to have to walk off the floor now, but here's the thing. I'm just asking any one of the members of either side of the aisle to say, are we going to stop doing that? At some point, are we going to stop doing that? Stop spending money we don't have. Stop cooking all these bills up in back rooms and dropping them on the floor like happened just today with a 4,400-page, $860 billion National Defense Authorization Act, airdropped onto the floor, take it or leave it. So I left it, and I have to vote against defense, which is not exactly where I want to be. But I'm sure as heck not going to continue to go down this road and look at my kids and grandkids one day and say, well, too bad, your country's bankrupt. I hope my colleagues will wake up tomorrow and say they want to avoid having to say the same thing to their kids or grandkids. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield back.